It's good to see you today. I appreciate you tuning in for this brief look into God's Word. Today, this week, we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. And before we start reading, and we're just going to be looking at the first few verses today, there in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, let's read a little bit in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 just to remind ourselves of where we left off last week. So we'll just back up just a hair, just to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And as we can see, of course, it starts off, and we talked about how Paul got into the gifts, the topic of the gifts, pretty quickly. Then we get into the divisions in the church, that which had been reported by Chloe's household, some of the things that were happening. Then you have verses 18 down through verse 31, where it talks about for example, verse 20, where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Verse 22, for Jews request a sign and Greeks seek after wisdom. And we spoke about how the Lord's way is better than their ways, whether you're Jews or Greeks. The Jews requesting a sign, an adulterous generation seeks after a sign. But at the same time, as the Jews requested a sign had been given to them. Sign of the prophet Jonah. The Greeks seek after wisdom. Well, this is wisdom. It's God's wisdom. It's not worldly wisdom, and that's the issue, that they saw it as foolishness. To the Jews, a stumbling block; to the Greeks, foolishness. Verse 26, for you see your calling, brethren. And there's a reason that I wanted to kind of review these just a little bit. Not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. And I think that's sufficient to get us into chapter 2 today. First 5 verses. And I, brethren, when I came to you, did not come with excellence of speech or of wisdom, declaring to you the testimony of God. For I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. For I was with you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling, and my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. So to look at our passage and to think about, how did Paul come? Not with excellence of speech, not with persuasive words, he says. Why were they following? Earlier there in chapter 1, and this is why I wanted to review those few verses. Look back at the passage. When I came, I did not come with excellence of speech or of wisdom, declaring to you the testimony of God. Why were they following different individuals that are spoken about in chapter 1? It probably pertains to this sort of thing that we're talking about. What Paul is doing is he is wanting them to remember how he came to them. He was the one who initially taught the gospel to them. He was the one, I believe he says in another place, you may have a lot of teachers, but you don't have many fathers. And he's talking about the one who initially, as they were born again, the one who's initially there. When he came, he's saying, remember how I came to you. I didn't come to you like these guys are coming to you. I didn't come to you with excellent speech. I didn't come to you with persuasive words. You need to remember, how did I come? Not with those things. I came, I was with you in weakness and fear, is what he says, in weakness and fear. Look over here in 2 Corinthians, because this is going to come up again in chapter 10. Here in chapter 10, look at verse, it's not chapter 10, pardon me, 2 Corinthians. I'm in the wrong book altogether. In the second letter to the Corinthians, in chapter 10 at verse 10, look at what he says. Verse 8, for even if I should boast somewhat more about our authority, which the Lord gave us for edification, and not for your destruction, I shall not be ashamed, lest I seem to terrify you by letters. For his letters, they say, are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech contemptible. That was how some of them at Corinth, at least some of them, were viewing Paul, as his letters are weighty and powerful, his bodily presence is weak, and his speech is contemptible. That was how they viewed him. Here in First Corinthians, to get back to it, here in First Corinthians, he's saying, remember how I came to you. I was with you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling. When he was at Corinth, this was the place where the Lord actually had to speak to him and say, do not be afraid. No one's going to attack you. What was happening in Corinth? There was violence. People were being violent. Sosthenes was beaten. This was what was happening. They brought Paul to the judgment seat. This is what was happening. There's a reason the Lord said, do not be afraid. When Paul was with them, he was with them in fear and in weakness, and especially that weakness. That passage, I think in 2 Corinthians 10, helps us out, that this was how they viewed him. His letters were one thing, but his bodily presence, weak. His speech was contemptible. He's saying, remember how I came to you. And contrasts that with whoever these individuals are in Corinth. And this is going to be the theme over at least these first few chapters. These people here in Corinth, these false teachers, they were coming a different way. Let's put it like that. But Paul also says here in the passage, he says, I was with you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling, and my speech and my preaching were not, you might think about also, my speech and my preaching, two different things, were not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. When Paul was at Corinth, what he talks about, and I think what's being spoken about, is the same thing perhaps over in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And I want to look as much as I can to connect the dots between the two letters and the passages between the two letters. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12 at verse 12, truly the signs of an apostle were accomplished among you with all perseverance and signs and wonders and mighty deeds. The signs of an apostle were done. 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Yes, I was with you in weakness and fear and in much trembling, not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. How did Paul come? Not with excellent speech, in weakness and fear, in demonstration, the signs of the apostle. The reason for all this, what was the reason? There is a purpose. Notice what it says, that your faith, verse 5, that your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. That is the purpose. That was the reason that Paul came to them this way, not with excellent speech, in weakness and fear, in demonstration, the signs of an apostle. That was not to glorify the apostles. That was to confirm the message, like we spoke about last week. That demonstration was done, though, and it was demonstrated for a purpose. To look at our list now, like I mentioned last week, I'm going to try to make sure that we make some applications for us today. Sometimes people will follow teachers and preachers based on nothing more than style. Understand why Paul is talking about this. Why does Paul want them to remember how he came? It's because how he came is so different than what was happening now in Corinth with these false teachers. As Corinth was dividing up into these factions, as quarrels were breaking out, Paul says, remember where I came from, and contrast that with these individuals and what they're doing. For an application, some people only follow preachers and teachers because of their personal style, or perhaps because they are great speakers in their estimation, because of their oratorial skills, because of their speaking skills, Or perhaps it's because the people are popular. Or perhaps, and this is another reason I wanted to read those last few verses in chapter 1, perhaps because they're mighty, noble, rich, businessmen, positions of authority, perhaps in the secular world. Whatever the case may be, why were individuals in Corinth being sucked in to this system of following these different individuals rather than having faith in the power of God? That's the question. Paul says, remember how I came to you, because how I came to you is so different than what is happening now. Remember that. Remember that. Make the application, and the same goes for us today. Where's our faith in? Where's our faith? Who do we follow? What do we follow? Is it about the substance, or is it about the form? Paul, his body is weak and contemptible. His speech is contemptible. He doesn't use big, fancy, persuasive words. Make the application. As we look at these different things, that's what Paul's trying to get the Corinthians to do. To remember how they got where they were in a good way, and to reflect on where they are also in a negative way, because they're going to have some choices to make going forward. A little bit of our daily bread today. Appreciate you tuning in. Hope you have a good day. I hope the week goes well for you. I hope you tune in tomorrow morning as well for another study from God's Word. Thanks for being with us today.